March 6, 1945, 3:20 p.m. Cologne Cathedral Square, Germany. A Panther tank fires point-blank at an American vehicle. 300 meters. The round hits dead center on the frontal armor and bounces off. The German gunner stares through his scope in disbelief. In 3 years of war, that has never happened. Then the American gun speaks back. One shot, one kill. The Panther erupts in a column of fire so intense that the crew inside never had time to scream. 15 seconds. That is all it took to shatter 3 years of German armored supremacy. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who refuse to forget. My name is Robert Early, Staff Sergeant, United States Army. Before the war, I fixed truck engines at a garage in rural Ohio for $11 a week. My hands smelled like grease every day of my adult life. I was nobody special, just a mechanic who knew how engines breathed. On March 6, 1945, inside a tank his crew had nicknamed Eagle 7, Robert Early gave one order that changed the course of armored warfare in Europe. His gunner fired a single 90mm round that didn't just destroy a German tank. It destroyed a myth. The myth that American armor was inferior. The myth that Germany's Tigers and Panthers were invincible. The myth that the United States, a nation of factory workers and farmhands, could never match German engineering perfection. By the time the smoke cleared over Cologne Cathedral Square that afternoon, that myth was burning alongside the wreckage of the Panther. And somewhere across the Western Front, in command posts and tank bivouacs and field headquarters, German commanders were asking a question they had never expected to ask. What is that thing the Americans are driving? To understand why that question mattered so much, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when Germany was winning. Back to when every Allied tank crew went to sleep terrified and woke up more terrified. August 1942. Leningrad. The Tiger tank enters combat for the first time. Nothing on the Allied side can stop it at normal combat ranges. The Tiger's 88mm gun punches through enemy armor at distances where return fire is nearly useless. Its turret front runs 100mm thick. Reinforced sections around the gun reach close to 120mm. The mathematics are brutally simple. An M4 Sherman's 75mm gun can only threaten the Tiger's frontal armor at roughly 100 to 200 meters, and even then it is difficult. But the Tiger's 88mm can pierce a Sherman's front at 2,000 meters. 2,000 meters. That is over a mile. Allied tank crews can barely see a Tiger at that distance, a dark smudge on the horizon, and that smudge can already kill them. The psychological damage spreads faster than the tanks themselves. Allied crews begin calling it Tiger fever. Every German tank becomes a tiger in their minds. Every engagement a brush with an invincible monster. Commanders receive frantic radio reports of Tigers in positions where only Panzer IVs exist. Infantry units refuse to advance without tank support. Tank units refuse to advance without artillery. The fear multiplies and compounds until it becomes something close to paralysis. German tank crews feel it from the other direction. They paint kill rings on their gun barrels, like fighter pilots counting victories. Veterans of the heavy tank battalions describe something approaching invincibility, a certainty that they are operating weapons beyond the reach of their enemies. And for a long time in engagement after engagement across North Africa and Italy, and then Normandy, that certainty is justified. By late 1944, the Tiger's advantage has narrowed somewhat. Allied guns are improving. Tank destroyers are getting deadlier. But the fundamental psychological reality has not shifted. German heavy armor is still superior. Everyone on both sides knows it. The training manuals say so. 3 years of combat experience confirm it. And then there is the other reality, the one the German high command is not tracking carefully enough. 8,000 kilometers away in Detroit and Flint and Grand Blanc, Michigan, American engineers have been working since 1942 on something the Germans have decided is impossible. They are building a heavy tank. Not just heavier than the Sherman. A fundamentally new design with a gun that changes everything. The story of how that tank got built, and what it did when it finally reached the front, is a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. About a nation that was underestimated right up until the moment it stopped being underestimatable. It starts with a welder named Harold Poole. Harold Poole was 34 years old in 1942. He had spent 11 years working the floor at Fisher Body Division General Motors in Grand Blanc, Michigan. He welded car frames. Then he welded tank hulls. He could run a perfect bead on curved steel in his sleep, and during the war years, he often nearly did pulling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week without complaint. Harold was not an engineer. He did not have a college education. He had a high school diploma, steady hands, and an instinct for metal that his foreman called supernatural. Harold Poole was also the first man at Grand Blanc to understand that the new tank they were being asked to build was going to be different in a way that mattered enormously. In the spring of 1943, Fisher Body received new orders. The Sherman production lines were not stopping, but alongside them, a new project was beginning. The T-26 program. A tank with heavier armor, a lower profile, and a gun pulled directly from anti-aircraft and tank destroyer platforms. The 90mm M3. A weapon that fired a 24-pound armor-piercing shell at over 2,800 feet per second. Harold Poole was assigned to the new hull assembly team, and the first time he saw the armor specifications, he set down his welding torch and stared at the blueprints for a long moment. The frontal armor on this thing was different. Not just thicker, angled in ways that multiplied its effective resistance far beyond what the raw measurements suggested. He had welded Sherman hulls for 2 years. He knew what Sherman armor looked like, how it was shaped where it was thin. This was something else entirely. He told his shift supervisor that evening, and I'm paraphrasing from his post-war account collected by the Patton Museum, that it felt like going from building a wooden door to building a bank vault. Same basic idea. Completely different result. Harold's insight mattered because the engineers designing the T-26 were working from calculations and testing data. Harold was working from feel from the accumulation of thousands of hours, understanding how metal behaved under stress. When the first hull prototypes came off the line with small fabrication problems in the angled front plate, it was Harold who identified the welding sequence causing the issue, not the engineers. His solution reduced distortion in the critical frontal section by a margin that improved the armor's ballistic resistance at exactly the angle most likely to face enemy fire. He never received a commendation for this. His name does not appear in any official development history of the M26. He was just a welder from Grand Blanc. But the tank that eventually rolled into Cologne Cathedral Square on March 6, 1945, had a front plate that held together under German fire, partly because of what Harold Poole figured out on a factory floor in Michigan. The idea that the United States should build this tank at all had been called insane by more than a few senior voices in 1942 and 1943. The argument against it was seductive in its logic. American doctrine held that tanks should not fight tanks. Tank destroyers handled that job. Tanks were exploitation weapons, breakthrough weapons designed to race through gaps punched by artillery and infantry and wreak havoc in the enemy rear. Building a heavy tank, optimized for direct combat with other heavy tanks, violated the entire doctrinal foundation that American armored forces were built upon. More than that, it would disrupt production. The Sherman was rolling off lines in enormous numbers. Converting factory space, retraining workers, retooling machinery, all of it would cost time and money and output. Some generals argued that the Sherman was good enough if used correctly, that the solution to Tiger tanks was tactics and numbers, not a new design that would arrive too late and in too few numbers to matter. The counter-argument came from men who had actually fought Tigers in Italy, from tank commanders who had watched their crews burn inside Shermans that could not penetrate German frontal armor at any practical range. From officers who understood that no amount of tactical brilliance compensates for a gun that cannot kill the enemy's tank before the enemy's tank kills you. The debate within American ordnance and armor branches was fierce, prolonged, and at times genuinely bitter. It delayed the T-26 program by months. It nearly killed it entirely in early 1943 when production priorities shifted and funding was questioned. The men advocating for the new heavy tank were told repeatedly that their timeline was impossible, that their armor goals were unrealistic, that a 90mm gun could not be successfully integrated into a mobile tank platform without sacrificing too much in speed and reliability. They kept pushing anyway. The first true prototype test happened in the fall of 1943 at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The weather was cold and wet, the kind of gray October day that makes everything feel harder than it should. A small group of engineers, ordnance officers, and factory representatives gathered to watch the T-26 prototype fire at test armor panels set at various ranges and angles. The tension was considerable. Years of arguments, millions of dollars in development costs, and the credibility of everyone who had fought for this program were riding on what happened in the next few hours. The first round fired at 500 meters against armor equivalent to Tiger front plate. The result was recorded in the test data with the clinical language of official documents, but the men watching understood immediately what they were seeing. Penetration, clean, complete. They ran the test again, same result. They tried different angles. They increased the range. They pushed the gun to distances that approached the outer limits of practical battlefield engagement. The 90mm M3 performed at every threshold meeting or exceeding the penetration figures the engineers had predicted. One of the ordnance officers present, a man who had spent the previous 18 months arguing that the program was unnecessary, watched the final test sequence and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he turned to the project lead and said simply, "We should have done this sooner." The testing did not end the arguments. Nothing ends arguments in military procurement that quickly. But it shifted the weight of evidence decisively. The T-26 program moved forward with new urgency, and the factories began the enormous task of preparing for production. Fisher Body's Grand Blanc plant, the same facility where Harold Poole welded Sherman hulls 6 days a week, began the conversion process. New jigs, new fixtures, new welding sequences for the more complex hull geometry. Workers who had spent years developing muscle memory for Sherman production had to relearn procedures that looked similar but demanded different tolerances, different timings, different standards of precision. Harold Poole trained younger welders on the new hull sections for months. He showed them how the angled front plate behaved differently from flat armor under the heat of the welding torch, how the cooling sequence affected the metal's grain structure in ways that could subtly weaken the joint if you weren't paying attention. He worked without fanfare, without any particular awareness that he was participating in something historically significant. He was just doing his job, getting it right. By January 1945, the first 20 T-26 E-3 tanks were loaded onto ships in a port on the American East Coast. The operation was designated Zebra Mission. The crews who accompanied them had trained on the vehicles at Fort Knox, Kentucky. They had been told in terms that left no room for ambiguity that the tanks they were escorting were to be referred to as new Shermans if anyone asked. No other description. No technical details. The secrecy was not about hiding the tanks from the enemy, not exactly. It was about controlling the moment of revelation. When the Germans first encountered the Pershing in combat, the Americans wanted it to be a surprise, a complete, total, devastating surprise. The Atlantic crossing took the shipment through waters still patrolled by German submarines. The men aboard knew what they were carrying. Some of them understood in a way that went beyond the official briefings that the tanks in the hold represented a fundamental shift in what the United States could put on a battlefield. Not just a new model, a new category. They docked at Antwerp in late January 1945. The tanks were transferred to 1st U.S. Army and divided between the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions operating near the Roer River and around Düren. Each Pershing was painted in standard olive drab given normal unit markings and positioned within Sherman companies in a way designed to minimize attention. 1 Pershing per company. Mixed in camouflaged by proximity to familiar shapes. The orders given to Pershing crews were precise and somewhat unusual. Avoid combat unless engaging German heavy tanks. The goal was to keep the vehicle's capabilities secret as long as possible, to wait for the right moment, to save the revelation for an encounter that would matter. On February 25, 1945, the first Pershing reached frontline conditions. And on February 26th, near the town of Elsdorf, the first one was knocked out. A Tigers 88mm round struck the gun mantlet and killed the gunner and loader instantly. A terrible introduction to combat. And yet, even in that loss, something significant happened. The Americans recovered the tank. They repaired it. By March 7th, Eagle 7, or a Pershing indistinguishable from it, was back in action. In a German army where damaged heavy tanks increasingly stayed damaged, where spare parts were a memory, and recovery operations were abandoned under air attack, the Americans had taken their first Pershing loss and simply fixed it. This detail, almost a footnote in the official record, carried its own message about the difference in industrial and logistical capacity between the two sides. But the moment that changed everything came 10 days later, in a city that had already been bombed into a landscape of rubble and broken stone, in a square dominated by a cathedral that had somehow survived while everything around it collapsed. Cologne, March 6, 1945, 3:20 p.m. Wilhelm Bartelborg was a veteran Panther commander with Panzer Brigade 106. He had survived the retreat from France. He had fought through the desperate winter battles of late 1944. He had developed the intuition that keeps tank commanders alive, the sense of terrain and angle and timing that separates the survivors from the dead. He positioned his Panther in Cathedral Square, using rubble from bombed buildings as partial hull cover. The open space gave clear sight lines in multiple directions. When American tanks approached through the ruins of the city, he would see them from hundreds of meters away. He had done this before. He knew how it ended. He saw movement near the destroyed Geryon Hotel through his periscope. An American tank, extended gun barrel, unusual profile. But the range was 300 meters, point blank. Whatever variant of Sherman this was, the Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun would kill it in a single shot. He had done it dozens of times. He gave the order to fire. In Part 2, the gun speaks, the myth dies, and the tremor that begins in Cologne Cathedral Square spreads outward across the entire German armored force. 30 kilometers away in the command post of Oberkommando West, a report arrives that no one knows how to file. And the question being asked in every German tank unit from the Ruhr to the Rhine becomes the same terrifying question. How many of those things do the Americans actually have? March 6, 1945. Cologne Cathedral Square. Staff Sergeant Robert Early's Eagle 7 absorbed a Panther round at 300 meters and fired back once. The Panther died in 15 seconds. The myth of German armored invincibility died with it. But the story didn't end in Cologne. It was just beginning. Because 30 kilometers away in a German command post, receiving the first fragmented reports of what happened in that cathedral square, a senior intelligence officer read the field dispatch and made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He filed it under unconfirmed. Possible Sherman variant. Requires verification. That decision bought the Americans something more valuable than any tank. It bought them time. But here is what almost nobody knows about the Pershing story. The tank that destroyed Bartelborg's Panther in Cologne nearly didn't exist at all. Not because of German opposition, not because of manufacturing problems, because of a room full of American generals who spent the better part of 2 years insisting that building it was a waste of time. In the summer of 1943, while Harold Poole welded hull sections at Grand Blanc and engineers at Aberdeen ran penetration tests, the T-26 program faced an enemy more dangerous than any Tiger tank. It faced the United States Army's own institutional resistance. And that resistance had a name, a rank, and an office in the Pentagon. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair commanded Army Ground Forces. He was brilliant, experienced, and absolutely certain that heavy tanks were a strategic mistake. His doctrine was elegant in its logic. Tanks exploit. Tank destroyers kill tanks. Building a heavy tank optimized for armor versus armor combat was, in McNair's view, exactly backwards. It was solving the wrong problem with the wrong tool at enormous cost. In September 1943, the T-26 program's chief advocate, Colonel Joseph Colby, was summoned to a meeting that everyone in the room understood was not really a meeting. It was a verdict. McNair sat at the head of the table with two other general officers flanking him. He had the Aberdeen test reports in front of him. He had read them. That was not the problem. "Colonel," McNair said without looking up from the documents, "your gun penetrates the Tiger's front armor at 500 meters. I'm aware of that." Colby waited. "What I'm also aware of," McNair continued, "is that our tank doctrine does not call for tanks to engage Tigers at 500 meters. Our tanks are not supposed to be near Tigers at all. That is what tank destroyers are for." Colby had prepared for this. "General, with respect, our tank crews in Italy are near Tigers. Regularly. And they are dying because their guns cannot answer." McNair set down the report. "Then they are being used incorrectly." The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Colby left it with the T-26 program's funding cut by 30% and a formal directive requiring additional justification before production authorization could proceed. He had 6 weeks to produce it, or the program would be suspended indefinitely. 6 weeks. Meanwhile, in Italy, Sherman crews were dying at a rate that the casualty reports in Washington described in the sanitized language of attrition statistics. Behind those statistics were men who burned. Colby needed an ally. He found one in the most unlikely possible place. Brigadier General Maurice Rose commanded the 3rd Armored Division. He was aggressive, forward-thinking, and he had personally watched Sherman's fail against German armor in engagements where no tactical adjustment could have changed the outcome. He had written 3 separate reports to Army ground forces documenting specific instances where superior German gun range had cost his division tanks and crews that should have survived. Those reports had been received, acknowledged, and filed. Rose and Colby met in October 1943 in a borrowed office at the War Department. Rose had brought his own documentation. Specific engagements, specific ranges, specific rounds fired versus rounds that penetrated. "They keep telling me it's a doctrine problem," Rose said. "That my people aren't positioning correctly. I've got a sergeant who put his Sherman hull down at 2,000 meters against a Tiger, and the Tiger still killed him. What doctrine fixes that?" Colby laid out the T-26 numbers, the penetration data, the production timeline, the ask. Rose read everything carefully. Then he picked up the phone and called a man he had served with in North Africa, a man who now had direct access to General Omar Bradley's staff. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic in the conventional sense. It was meetings and memos and carefully worded recommendations moving through channels. But at the end of those 3 weeks, the T-26 program had its funding restored and a production authorization signed by Bradley's chief of staff. McNair's objections were noted in the record and overruled. The program now had one formal condition attached: a live-fire demonstration observed by Army Ground Forces representatives, proving that the 90mm M3 gun could perform in field conditions, not just Aberdeen test conditions at ranges and against armor configurations that reflected actual combat geometry. One demonstration. If it failed to satisfy the observers, the program returned to McNair's desk for final disposition. The date was set for November 18, 1943. Fort Knox, Kentucky. The morning arrived, gray and cold, temperature sitting at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, ground frozen hard enough to wring under boots. The demonstration range had been set up with captured German armor panels positioned at distances ranging from 300 to 1,500 meters. Several panels were angled to replicate the oblique presentations that German tank commanders used instinctively to increase effective armor thickness. Colonel Colby was there before dawn. So was the T-26 prototype crew, 4 men who had spent the previous 3 weeks doing nothing except live inside that tank and learn exactly how it behaved under every condition they could simulate. Their gunner, a 23-year-old corporal from Alabama named James Perkins, who had grown up shooting deer at ranges that impressed people who didn't grow up in rural Alabama, had fired over 200 rounds in preparation. He knew the guns zero its drift at temperature, the way the reticle settled after traverse. The Army Ground Forces observers arrived at 0800. There were 5 of them. None looked particularly interested in being impressed. The first target was the simplest, a flat armor panel equivalent to Tiger frontal thickness set at 500 meters. Standard approach. Perkins loaded, acquired, fired. The round punched through cleanly. The observers noted it without visible reaction. Second target. Same thickness angled at 30 degrees to replicate a Tiger hull in a hull-down defensive position. Harder shot. The effective armor thickness at that angle increased substantially. Perkins adjusted his point of aim slightly left to account for the angle fired. Penetration. Third target. Angled panel at 1,200 meters, representing a long-range engagement that exceeded the practical accuracy of any current Sherman armament. One of the observers, a colonel named Hartwell, spoke for the first time since the demonstration began. "That's outside practical range for a moving engagement." "Yes, sir," Colby said. "We're shooting from a static position. In combat, our tanks frequently engage from static or near-static positions. The Tiger can threaten us at this range. We cannot currently threaten back." Hartwell said nothing. He watched Perkins acquire the target. The shot took 11 seconds from command to fire. At 1,200 meters, the travel time was barely perceptible. The armor panel buckled and fell. Hartwell wrote something in his notebook. The fourth target was the one Colby had argued about with his own team for 2 weeks before including it. A full-thickness armor panel equivalent to the Tiger's gun mantlet, the thickest single armor concentration on the vehicle, positioned at 600 meters and angled at 45 degrees. The most difficult shot on the range, the one most likely to fail. If it failed, the observers would write their report around that failure. The one that didn't penetrate. Perkins took longer on this one. 40 seconds from command to fire, which felt like considerably longer to everyone watching. He adjusted his elevation twice. The gun moved in tiny increments. He fired. The round struck the center of the panel. The panel did not fall. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the panel tilted slowly and dropped forward into the frozen ground. Penetration. Partial, but penetration. Colby looked at Hartwell. Hartwell was still writing. The final measurement that day was not on the range card. After the formal demonstration ended, Perkins ran a rate-of-fire test while the observers were reviewing their notes. He loaded and fired 6 aimed rounds in 70 seconds. The Sherman's 75mm under ideal conditions with an experienced crew could manage a similar rate. But the 90mm shells weighed nearly 3 times as much, and the penetration at range was incomparable. One of the junior observers did the arithmetic aloud without meaning to. At 1,500 meters, this gun could engage a Tiger. The Sherman can't do that at any range with any reliability. Nobody disagreed. The report that Hartwell submitted 4 days later recommended production authorization for the T-26 program with immediate priority classification. McNair received a copy. He wrote one line in the margin and initialed it. The line read, "Proceed as recommended." The T-26 became the M-26. Fisher Body's Grand Blanc plant began full conversion in early 1944. Harold Poole trained his welding teams on the new hull sections. The production line absorbed the new design and began building. By September 1944, the first completed M-26 Pershings were undergoing final acceptance testing. By December, they were being loaded for Atlantic transit. By January 1945, 20 of them were crossing the ocean under a security classification that described them as new Shermans. The German commanders receiving field reports in the spring of 1945 were not dealing with a weapon that appeared suddenly. They were dealing with the product of 2 years of fighting through institutional resistance of one colonel, finding one general willing to pick up a telephone of one gunner from Alabama, spending 3 weeks learning a gun the way most people learn a language until it became instinct. They were dealing with the consequence of a demonstration on a frozen Kentucky morning, when a round struck a tilted armor panel and the panel slowly, almost reluctantly fell forward. But the Pershing was now in combat. 20 tanks among thousands, and German commanders were filing reports that their superiors did not know how to interpret. An American tank with a gun in the 90mm class. Frontal armor that deflects Panther rounds at 300 meters. Multiple confirmed sightings across different sectors, different units, different engagements. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss, too specific to be panic or misidentification. And somewhere in the intelligence apparatus of Oberkommando West, a different question was forming. Not what is this tank, but how many of them exist? How many are coming? The Germans were about to discover that the answer to that question was the most terrifying part of the entire story. Because while they were counting 20 Pershings on the Western Front, American factories had already built over 2,000 more. And in Part 3, when that number reaches the right desk in the right German headquarters, the psychological collapse that began in Cologne Cathedral Square accelerates into something that changes how entire units fight, how commanders make decisions, and how the final weeks of the war in Europe actually end. In Part 1, a welder named Harold Poole helped build a tank the Army didn't want. In Part 2, Colonel Colby fought through 2 years of institutional resistance to get it authorized, demonstrated, and shipped. 20M. 26 Pershings crossed the Atlantic under false names, destroyed German armor in Cologne Cathedral Square, and proved that American engineering had achieved something the Germans had declared impossible. But the Germans were now paying attention. And when the full intelligence picture reached Oberkommando West in mid-March 1945, the number that appeared in the summary report was not 20. It was not even 200. American production figures pieced together from captured documents, aerial reconnaissance of factory sites, and prisoner interrogations suggested that the United States had already manufactured well over 1,000 MM-26 hulls and was accelerating output monthly. 1,000. Against the 1,347 Tiger tanks Germany had built across the entire war. And now, here is where the story stops being about a tank and starts being about what happens to men when they realize the mathematics have turned permanently against them. The intelligence report reached General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach on March 14, 1945. Eberbach was not a man who panicked easily. He had commanded armor on the Eastern Front, had fought through Normandy, had managed defensive operations under conditions that would have broken lesser commanders. He read the production estimate twice. Then he summoned his operations staff. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. The conclusion was brutal in its clarity. Germany had been fighting under the assumption that American tank quality was permanently inferior, that tactical skill and superior German engineering could compensate for the numerical disadvantage. That assumption was now demonstrably false on both counts. The Americans had matched German armor quality and retained their overwhelming production advantage simultaneously. Eberbach ordered immediate redistribution of remaining Tiger and King Tiger assets. Heavy tanks were to be concentrated at choke points and held in reserve, not committed to offensive actions. Engagement doctrine changed overnight. German tank commanders received new instructions. Do not engage American armor at ranges under 800 meters unless position is untenable. Attempt to identify vehicle type before engaging. If target appears to be a new heavy variant, withdraw and report. That last instruction tells you everything. German commanders were now asking their tank crews to determine whether the approaching American vehicle was the kind that could kill them before deciding whether to fight. In the confusion of combat in smoke and rubble and failing light, that identification was nearly impossible. The uncertainty became its own weapon. German training schools scrambled to produce recognition materials for the Pershing. Captured photographs were poor quality. Dimensional data was incomplete. The rushed recognition charts that circulated through panzer units in late March 1945 described the Pershing's distinguishing features with the uncertainty of men working from second-hand accounts. Longer gun barrel than Sherman, lower profile, different turret shape. None of these characteristics were easily visible at combat ranges under stress. German tank loss rates in the sectors where Pershings were confirmed present increased by an estimated 30 to 40% compared to equivalent engagements in sectors with only Shermans. Some of this increase reflected the Pershing's direct combat effectiveness, but a significant portion reflected German crews choosing to withdraw rather than engage an uncertain threat, abandoning positions that might have been held, surrendering terrain that cost Allied infantry nothing to occupy. The psychological weapon was working better than the mechanical one. But the Pershing program was not without its own serious problems. By late March 1945, the 3rd Armored Division's maintenance crews were confronting a transmission issue that the Fort Knox testing had not fully exposed. The M-26's transmission, a torque converter system that represented a genuine engineering advance over the Sherman's manual gearbox, was failing at a rate that alarmed everyone responsible for keeping the tanks operational. In cross-country movement over the broken terrain of Western Germany, the transmission seals degraded faster than replacement parts could be supplied. Of the 20 Pershings in theater in late February, 7 were non-operational due to mechanical issues by March 20th. Not combat damage, mechanical failure. Colonel John Devine, commanding the armored element of the 3rd Division, sent a report to 1st Army Headquarters that used language considerably less diplomatic than standard military correspondence. The gist was that he had been given 20 tanks that were supposed to change the battlefield dynamic, and that 35% of them were currently sitting behind the lines waiting for parts that the supply chain could not deliver fast enough. The report created exactly the kind of internal crisis that Colby and Rose had spent 2 years trying to prevent. McNair's faction within Army ground forces, now led by officers who shared his institutional skepticism about heavy tanks, circulated Devine's report with a pointed addendum. Reliability in field conditions is a fundamental requirement. This vehicle does not meet it. For approximately 10 days in late March 1945, the Pershing program's future beyond the current deployment was genuinely uncertain. The question of whether to order additional production beyond the units already completed and in transit was under active review. The men who had fought for the program were fighting for it again, this time against mechanical evidence rather than doctrinal objections. Harold Poole, still at Grand Blanc, was part of a small team pulled off the production line to work on the transmission sealing problem. He was not an engineer. He was a welder. But he had spent enough time around the hulls to understand how the transmission housing connected to the surrounding structure and where thermal stress during operation was concentrated. His contribution to the engineering solution was characteristically unglamorous. He identified a welding sequence issue in the transmission mount that was creating micro-stress fractures in the housing under sustained operational loads. The fractures propagated to the seals. The seals failed. The fix took 11 days to develop and test. It was incorporated into production units immediately and retrofitted to deployed vehicles as maintenance cycles permitted. Then came Dessau, April 21st, 1945. The 3rd Armored Division was pushing toward the Elbe River. Dessau was a medium-sized industrial city sitting astride a critical route defended by a mixed German force that included elements of the SS and 2 King Tiger tanks that had somehow maintained operational status despite the fuel shortages strangling most heavy German armor. King Tigers, the largest, most heavily armored German production tank of the war. 185 millimeters of frontal armor on the turret. An 88 millimeter gun that could kill any Allied tank at combat ranges. 2 of them positioned to cover the main approach into the city, supported by infantry in prepared positions and anti-tank guns covering the flanks. The American assault began at 0630. 2 companies of Shermans moved up the main approach and immediately drew fire from the German anti-tank guns on the flanks. 2 Shermans burned in the first 4 minutes. The advance stalled. A single Pershing, commanded by Sergeant First Class Thomas McCall, was positioned 800 meters back on a slight rise that gave a partial line of sight down the approach corridor. McCall could see the rooftops of the buildings where German spotters were directing fire. He could see the smoke from the burning Shermans. He could not yet see the King Tigers. He moved forward 200 meters to a position behind a collapsed factory wall, pushing the Pershing's nose through the rubble until the gun cleared with enough elevation to engage down the corridor. The movement took 4 minutes and sounded by crew accounts like driving through a rock quarry. At 0641, McCall acquired the first King Tiger, range approximately 900 meters. The King Tiger was hull down behind a rubble barrier, its massive turret visible from the mantelet up. The frontal turret armor at that angle represented an effective thickness that exceeded what the 90mm M3 had been tested against at Aberdeen. McCall's gunner, Corporal Dennis Fitch, did not aim for the mantlet. He aimed for the junction between the turret face and the gun shield, a point where the armored geometry created a slight weakness in the otherwise formidable protection. This was not in any training manual. Fitch had developed the targeting approach from conversations with other Pershing gunners over the previous 6 weeks, passed along informally, the way soldiers have always passed along knowledge that keeps them alive. Fitch fired. The round hit low on the turret face below his intended point of aim. It did not penetrate. The King Tiger's turret began to traverse toward them. Fitch reloaded in 8 seconds. The traverse speed of the King Tiger's turret was its most significant tactical weakness, a product of the tank's enormous mass. At full power, it needed 15 to 20 seconds to traverse 90 degrees. The King Tiger had approximately 12 seconds before it could bring its gun to bear on McCall's position. Fitch fired the second round at the same target point. The King Tiger stopped traversing. It did not explode immediately. It sat motionless for approximately 30 seconds while its crew processed what had happened. Then smoke began coming from the engine compartment. Then the ammunition cooked off, and the tank came apart from the inside. The second King Tiger, positioned 200 meters further down the corridor, began to reverse. It was moving away from the engagement, retreating from a threat it could not immediately counter. At that range and angle, with the second King Tiger presenting its side armor, as it turned, McCall had a shot geometry that the Aberdeen tests had rated as highly favorable. Fitch put a round through the side armor at 0644. The second King Tiger stopped moving and began to burn. Total engagement time from first shot to second, kill 3 minutes and 20 seconds. 2 King Tigers destroyed, 1 Pershing undamaged. The Sherman companies that had been pinned in the approach corridor moved forward within 8 minutes of the second King Tiger's destruction. The German anti-tank guns, whose crews had watched 2 of their heaviest armored assets eliminated in under 4 minutes, began abandoning their positions without orders. Infantry in the prepared positions pulled back into the city. Dessau fell by 1800 that evening. The official after-action report noted the destruction of 2 King Tiger tanks by M26, Pershing single vehicle at ranges between 900 and 1100 meters. It also noted that German resistance in the city collapsed significantly faster than pre-assault planning had projected, a fact the report attributed to the loss of the heavy armored anchor positions. What the after-action report could not capture was what Sergeant McCall described to his division's historical officer 3 weeks later. "The thing I remember most," McCall said, "is how fast the infantry gave up after the second Tiger went. They'd been fighting hard. Then they just stopped. Like somebody turned something off. Something had been turned off. The certainty that German armor could protect German infantry from American firepower. When that certainty died in the approach corridor at Dessau, the infantry that depended on it lost the psychological foundation that had sustained their resistance." The Dessau engagement circulated through First Army within 48 hours. Not as a formal report, but as the kind of story that moves through armies, the way all important information moves from crew to crew, from unit to unit, retold in mess lines and maintenance yards, and the brief quiets between engagements. A single Pershing, 2 King Tigers, 3 minutes. German prisoners captured in the Dessau sector over the following week were asked about the engagement during interrogation. Several had heard about it from their own side. The accounts they had received were not distorted by the distance of rumor. They were essentially accurate. 2 King Tigers destroyed at range by an American tank they could not identify from description alone. One prisoner, a Panzer NCO with 4 years of service who had fought on 3 fronts, told his interrogator that when he heard the account, his first thought was not tactical. It was simpler than that. He thought, "We cannot win this." By the end of April 1945, that thought had become the dominant reality across German armored forces on the Western Front. Not because of the Pershing alone. The fuel was gone, the spare parts were gone, the air cover was gone, the strategic position was irretrievable. But the Pershing had provided something specific and concrete that all the other catastrophes had not. It had answered the one question German tank crews had been able to answer in their favor for 3 years. Whose tanks are better? The answer, as of March 6th in Cologne Cathedral Square and April 21st in the approach corridor at Dessau, was no longer certain. And for men who had sustained themselves on that certainty through years of retreat and loss, uncertainty was its own form of collapse. But there is a chapter of this story that almost never gets told. What happened to the men who built the Pershing? What happened to Harold Poole and Colonel Colby and the thousands of workers and engineers and factory floor supervisors whose names appear nowhere in the history books? And what the Pershing's real legacy turned out to be, not in 1945, but in the decades that followed, when the lessons learned in Cologne and Dessau shaped every American tank that came after. That story is part 4, and it is stranger and more human than anything that came before. From a welder named Harold Poole, who saw something wrong in a hull section at Grand Blanc, to Colonel Colby, fighting 2 years of institutional resistance in Pentagon conference rooms, to Sergeant McCall, destroying 2 King Tigers in 3 minutes and 20 seconds at Dessau. The M26 Pershing traveled from impossible to inevitable across 4 years of American industrial will. But the cliffhanger at the end of Part 3 asked a different question. Not what the Pershing did to the war. What the war did to the people who built and fought the Pershing. The answer is more complicated, more human, and in one case, more surprising than anything that happened on the battlefield. Harold Poole came home to Grand Blanc in September 1945. The Fisher body plant was already converting back. Car frames instead of tank hulls. The jigs he had spent months learning were being dismantled and replaced with peacetime tooling. Within 6 weeks of VJ Day, the production line that had built 1,190 M26 Pershings was building Chevrolet body panels. Harold went back to welding car frames. Same work. Same smell of hot metal and flux. Same 11-hour shifts, though the pay had improved somewhat. He received no commendation for his contribution to the transmission housing fix that kept deployed Pershings operational through the critical weeks of March and April 1945. His name appeared in no official history. The engineering report that documented the solution listed the fix under a working group designation without individual attribution. He was not bitter about this based on the one recorded account of his post-war recollections given to a local Michigan newspaper in 1962, when a journalist was writing about the war's industrial legacy. Harold told the reporter that he had not expected recognition. He had expected to do his job correctly, and had done it. The tanks worked. That was the point. What he did not know until that 1962 interview, when the journalist showed him a photograph, was that Eagle 7, the Pershing that Staff Sergeant Robert Early had commanded in Cologne Cathedral Square, was still in existence. It had been preserved. It was sitting in a museum. Harold looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he told the reporter that he recognized the front plate. Not from the photograph, from memory. He had welded that section of hull himself, or one indistinguishable from it, and he could see in the photograph a detail of the weld seam that he had refined over hundreds of repetitions. He could not prove it was the same hull. But he believed it was. The journalist asked how that made him feel. Harold said simply that it made him feel like the work had mattered. That was enough. Colonel Joseph Colby was promoted to brigadier general before the war ended. A recognition that reflected his program's success more than any formal acknowledgement of his specific role in fighting for it. He retired in 1952 and spent his remaining years writing technical assessments for the Ordnance Corps on contract. His memoir, written but never published, spent considerable time on the 18 months between September 1943 and March 1945, when the T-26 program had been one bad meeting away from cancellation on multiple occasions. Sergeant Thomas McCall, the Dessau engagement commander, received the Silver Star for his actions on April 21, 1945. He returned to Indiana, worked in agricultural equipment sales for 30 years, and spoke about the Dessau engagement precisely twice in public during his lifetime, both times at veterans events where direct questions were asked. He was not a man who dramatized things. When asked what he remembered most clearly about the moment the second King Tiger stopped moving, he said he remembered being cold. The heater in the Pershing was not functioning that morning. General Maurice Rose, who had picked up the telephone in October 1943 and made the call that effectively saved the T-26 program, was killed in action on March 30, 1945, 24 days before Germany surrendered. He was shot by a German SS soldier under disputed circumstances near Paderborn. He never knew that the tanks he had fought to build had helped break the German armored forces' will in the final weeks of the war. He never knew about Dessau. He died 24 days too early to see what his phone call had made possible. That is the part of the story that does not fit the clean narrative of triumph and recognition. The man most responsible for the Pershing existing at all did not live to see what it accomplished. The technical legacy of the M26 Pershing extended far beyond the 2,212 vehicles produced by October 1945. The design principles embedded in the Pershing, the sloped armor geometry, the 90mm gun integration, the wet ammunition stowage system that prevented the catastrophic fires that had killed so many Sherman crews, became the foundational template for American tank development through the next 3 decades. The M46 patent, introduced in 1948, was a direct evolution of the Pershing, with the transmission problems corrected and the engine replaced with a more reliable unit. When North Korean T-34s crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950 and began destroying American M24 light tanks with disturbing efficiency, it was M46. Patton's direct descendants of Harold Poole's hull sections that restored the battlefield balance. In the Korean War, American armor achieved a kill ratio against North Korean and Chinese armor that validated every argument Colby had made in those Pentagon conference rooms 7 years earlier. The M48 followed in 1952. The M60 in 1960. Each generation incorporated lessons learned from the Pershing's combat experience, refined through testing, modified through the accumulation of tactical knowledge that Sergeant McCall and Corporal Fitch and 100 other crews had developed informally and passed along in the way soldiers always pass along what keeps them alive. The principle that Harold Poole had understood intuitively, that the angle and integrity of the frontal armor mattered as much as its raw thickness, ran through every American main battle tank for 50 years. The wet ammunition stowage system, which the Pershing introduced to American tanks, and which the Sherman's appalling fire record had made obviously necessary, became a standard requirement in tank design specifications globally. Military historians estimate that this single feature, preventing ammunition cook-off fires in damaged tanks, saved thousands of tank crew lives across the Korean War, the Arab-Israeli conflicts, and every subsequent armored engagement where American-derived tanks were used. A precise number is impossible to establish. A reasonable estimate exceeds 10,000 lives across the subsequent 4 decades of armored warfare. 14 nations eventually operated the M26 Pershing, or its direct derivatives. The design influenced Soviet tank development as well-captured examples and technical documents informing improvements in the T-54 and T-55 programs that became the backbone of Warsaw Pact armor through the Cold War. The tank that American generals had called unnecessary in 1943 shaped armored warfare doctrine on both sides of the Iron Curtain for a generation. The deeper lesson of the Pershing story is not about tanks. It is about the specific failure mode of institutions when confronted with ideas that challenge their existing frameworks. General McNair was not stupid. He was not corrupt. He was not even wrong about the fundamental principles of armored doctrine as he understood them in 1943. His argument that tanks should not fight tanks, that tank destroyers existed for that purpose, was logically consistent with everything American armor theory had established through the 1930s and early 1940s. His resistance to the T-26 program was the resistance of a man whose mental model of how war worked was accurate for the war he had studied, not the war he was fighting. This is the institutional trap that appears in every era and every domain. Systems build expertise around existing conditions. When conditions change faster than the expertise updates, the expertise becomes an obstacle rather than an asset. McNair's doctrine was built for a battlefield where American armor did not face German heavy tanks in direct engagements. The battlefield in Italy in 1943 was not that battlefield. The battlefield in Normandy in 1944 was not that battlefield. And the doctrine maintained by institutional momentum and the genuine conviction of intelligent men kept sending Shermans to die against Tigers for 2 years longer than it should have. What broke the institutional resistance was not better arguments. Colby had better arguments from the beginning. What broke it was Rose's telephone call, which was not a technical intervention, but a political one. An influential voice choosing to spend credibility on an unconventional idea. The Pershing existed because one general decided that a welder's instinct about frontal armor and a colonel's reading of Italian casualty reports mattered more than institutional consensus. History is full of these moments, decisions made by individuals who chose to believe inconvenient evidence over comfortable doctrine. The development of radar in Britain during the 1930s, opposed by senior officers who believed bombers could not be stopped, and that early warning therefore served no purpose. The adoption of carrier aviation by the American Navy, resisted by battleship admirals, until Pearl Harbor made the argument for them. The introduction of systematic night navigation training in Bomber Command, which one group captain implemented against explicit instruction because the casualty rates among his crews were too high to accept. In each case, the innovation succeeded, not because institutions suddenly became wise, but because individuals found ways around institutional resistance long enough for results to speak. Colby found Rose. Rose found Bradley's staff. The results spoke in Cologne and at Dessau, and in the reports that crossed German commanders' desks in March and April 1945. Now the detail that most accounts of the Pershing leave out entirely. In 1947, the Army conducted a formal after-action analysis of the Pershing's combat record in the European theater. The report was classified at the time and remained largely unread for decades, available in declassified archives, but not widely cited in the popular histories of American armor. The report's conclusion regarding the psychological impact of the Pershing on German forces was more measured than the dramatic accounts that circulated in the post-war years. The analysts found that the Pershing's direct mechanical contribution, the actual tank's killed positions, taken advances enabled by its gun, was significant, but not decisive. 20 operational vehicles in a theater of thousands could not be otherwise. What the report identified as genuinely significant was something more difficult to quantify. German after-action reports and prisoner interrogation records showed a consistent pattern. Units that had confirmed or suspected Pershing contact demonstrated measurably higher rates of position abandonment, vehicle destruction by own crews, and unsolicited surrender than units in comparable tactical situations without Pershing contact. The analysts concluded that the tank's primary contribution was not firepower, but information. It told German tank crews something they had not known and could not process within their existing understanding of the war: that the Americans had matched them technically while retaining the production advantage that made technical matching irrelevant. The report recommended in its final section that future weapons development programs prioritize the psychological dimension of technological surprise as a primary design criterion alongside conventional performance metrics. A weapon that changes what the enemy believes about the battlefield, the analysts wrote, can be more decisive than a weapon that merely changes what the enemy can do on the battlefield. That recommendation, buried in a classified report in 1947, described what American defense technology has pursued in various forms ever since. Stealth aircraft that opponents cannot track. Precision munitions that strike targets opponents believed were protected by distance. Systems designed not just to destroy, but to demonstrate capability in ways that reshape enemy decision-making before a single engagement begins. Harold Poole's weld seams led here. Colonel Colby's Pentagon arguments led here. Sergeant McCall's 8-second reload at Dessau led here. The chain of consequence running from a welder in Grand Blanc, noticing something wrong with a hull section in 1943, to a classified report recommending psychological primacy in weapons design in 1947 is not a straight line. It passes through bureaucratic resistance and institutional politics, and the death of Maurice Rose 24 days before he could see what he had made possible. But it is a continuous chain. From an overlooked welder's instinct in a Michigan factory to 20 tanks crossing the Atlantic under false names to 3 minutes and 20 seconds in an approach corridor at Dessau. The Pershing program proved that democratic industrial capacity, when committed to a purpose, could outperform authoritarian engineering perfectionism on every axis simultaneously. Quality and quantity, innovation and production, technical achievement and psychological impact. The numbers that close the story are these: 2,212 Pershings produced against 1,839 Tigers of all variants built across the entire German war effort. 20 saw combat and helped end a war that had killed tens of millions of people. The wet stowage system they pioneered saved an estimated 10,000 tank crew lives in subsequent decades. The doctrinal lessons they demonstrated shaped armored warfare for 50 years across 14 nations. Harold Poole lived until 1979. He never received a commendation. He never appeared in a history book. But somewhere in a museum in Kentucky, there is a tank with weld seams on its front plate that a man from Grand Blanc once ran with steady hands on a 12-hour shift, believing correctly that getting it right was the whole point. The war was won by generals and strategists and the courage of men in combat. But it was also won by people whose names we do not know, who showed up and did the work and trusted that precision in the small things would eventually matter in the large ones. It always does.